Every journey begins with a single step, and every story holds its own meaning. Here on Fanfiction Story, we bring you tales that inspire, move your heart, and maybe change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you enjoy stories like this. Now let's begin the journey. 1991, New York City, a dock on Manhattan Island. A sinister transaction was unfolding here. This place was meant to have only darkness as its witness, but tonight, a third party lurked in the shadows. High above, on the steel beams of the warehouse roof, a figure nearly indistinguishable from the night itself coldly observed the two parties below. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the once brightly lit warehouse into pitch blackness. Water release, great shark bullet technique. A strikingly youthful voice echoed from above. A sharp whoosh cut through the air as if something, or someone, was hurtling downward at breakneck speed. Amid the sounds of crashing and splashing water, a brief scream erupted from the crowd below, only to be abruptly silenced. The muzzle flash of gunfire briefly illuminated the warehouse, but when the men looked up, they saw no trace of their assailant. Water release, exploding water shockwave. With this strange shout came an even louder surge of rushing water. A cacophony of furious shouts filled the warehouse. A shadowy figure darted through the chaos. The dockside warehouse, once alive with gunfire, fell silent in mere minutes, save for a few sporadic shots. The warehouse doors slowly creaked open, and a young man stepped out. Moonlight gently bathed his face, casting soft shadows that outlined his striking features. In the dim, flickering light, his long black eyelashes fluttered lightly, and his heterochromatic eyes gleamed with an eerie glow in the darkness. The young man, about to leave, suddenly paused, his gaze lingering on a sports car parked outside the warehouse. Moments later, the roar of the engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a scene of utter disarray at the dock. As the boy departed, two transparent figures materialized out of thin air on the open ground beside the warehouse. "Well, it seems young Kyle has quite the spark. What do you think, Newt?" said the older man with a long white beard, smiling warmly at his companion. The man called Newt responded slowly. With no one to guide him, he's mastered wandless magic, a highly advanced skill, and even created a few intriguing spells of his own. I dare say Hogwarts is about to get lively. The white-bearded man seemed pleased with Newt's assessment, his tone tinged with pride. After all, he does have some Dumbledore blood in him. At Albus Dumbledore's boast, Newt didn't hesitate to cut in. He's not exactly a Dumbledore, is he? Dumbledore's face fell, a touch exasperated. Kyle's practically half my son. Newt thought for a moment before delivering another jab, straight to Dumbledore's heart. The half-son you sent to an orphanage and then lost track of. Dumbledore, flustered, decided he was done discussing Kyle's origins with Newt. "Let's go, we're fetching Kyle." With a loud crack, Dumbledore vanished on the spot. Newt's figure followed suit, disappearing as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder over the dock. A sports car sped through the moonlight, its engine's roar echoing far down the empty highway. Soon, the car pulled into an abandoned factory in Brooklyn, coming to a stop on a flat patch of ground. Kyle sat in the driver's seat, calmly forming a series of hand seals. Earth release, ground shaking core. The ground beneath the car slowly sank, like the platform of a multi-level parking garage. In truth, it was a platform, one powered by chakra. The platform descended into a vast underground space. This was Kyle's secret base, where he had lived for the past 5 years. After parking the car, the patch of earth rose back up under the influence of his earth release jutsu, seamlessly blending with the surface above, leaving no trace of its movement. Kyle grabbed a briefcase from the passenger seat and approached an iron door, the entrance to his true living quarters. The base was fully equipped with everything one could need: living essentials, entertainment and fitness facilities, all luxuriously appointed. Deep underground, several generators hummed steadily, providing the base with a constant supply of electricity. Looking at the fruits of his labor, a smile spread across Kyle's face. Over the past 5 years, he had quietly built up quite the foundation. Kyle placed his spoils from the night on the living room table and began inspecting his haul. The sight of stacks of crisp $100 bills in the briefcase brought a brilliant smile to his face. This was, by far, his most lucrative haul since leaving the orphanage. Yes, Kyle was an orphan. By all accounts, he should have been in an orphanage or with an adoptive family. But beyond being an orphan, Kyle had another identity: a transmigrator from modern Earth. A bolt of lightning had inexplicably sent him hurtling into another world. When he awoke, he was a 1-year-old child, and the year was 1980. After piecing together the state of this world through newspapers, he realized it wasn't much different from the one he'd known in his previous life, just set a bit earlier in time. Originally, Kyle had planned to bide his time in the orphanage, growing up quietly until he could seize his first big opportunity. With his knowledge of future societal trends, he aimed to rise to the top. But that plan hit a snag when he was 6 years old. Kyle discovered to his shock that he was no ordinary child. He had powers. One day, a surge of electric energy coursed through his body, spilling out uncontrollably. By the time he came to his senses, his surroundings were in disarray. Fortunately, no one else was around during his awakening. He quickly cleaned up the scene and pretended nothing had happened. After several clandestine experiments, Kyle, well-versed in web novels and anime from his past life, found a way to roughly control and harness the energy within him. It was through hand signs, or rather hand seals. So his golden ticket was chakra. To avoid drawing attention to his abnormality and to secure a place where he could train his abilities, Kyle left the orphanage. He eventually settled on this abandoned factory in Brooklyn as his base. By day, he practiced the Naruto-style ninjutsu and taijutsu he recalled from his memories. By night, driven by the need to survive, Kyle roamed the streets, fishing for careless thugs who might generously donate their cash to him. The versatility of ninjutsu gave Kyle the ability to easily overpower an average adult, making short work of street punks. After years of trial and error, Kyle had mastered a few basic water release and earth release techniques. As for the great shark bullet and exploding water shockwave he'd shouted earlier, those were just names he made up on the spot. In reality, their power was probably closer to C-rank ninjutsu. This hidden underground base was the result of countless hours and effort, constructed using his earth release techniques. As his combat skills grew, Kyle's targets shifted from low-life thugs to more dangerous gangsters. The former, no matter how much you squeezed, could only cough up a few bucks, but the latter, the briefcase full of cash in front of him, was proof of just how lucrative his new targets could be. After roughly tallying his haul, Kyle tossed the stacks of bills into a safe nearby. But just as he was about to close the safe's door, an unusual sound caught his attention. The chakra-powered elevator to his base had been activated. How could anyone other than him possibly activate the chakra elevator? He had poured his heart and soul into designing such a complex entry method, skulking underground like an elderly Madara Uchiha playing mole, all to keep his hideout secret. How could someone else have found their way here? It was undeniable. The intruder was definitely here for him. Whether they came with good intentions or ill, that remained unclear. Kyle swiftly formed a dozen hand seals, channeling his chakra to ensure he could unleash a ninjutsu instantly if needed. With his left hand maintaining a single seal, his right reached under the table, pulling out a handgun and aiming it at the door. Who said a ninja couldn't use modern weapons? Times had changed, old man. The iron door of the hideout creaked open, revealing two silhouettes at the entrance. A single bullet struck the ground near their feet. State your purpose. Kyle aimed the gun at the heads of the two intruders, his voice ringing out. Albus Dumbledore gazed at Kyle's strikingly familiar heterochromatic eyes, his own eyes glistening faintly with moisture. But when his gaze met Kyle's wary, guarded expression, Dumbledore's face grew complex, words catching in his throat. A child living alone for 5 years must have endured great hardship. Yet as Dumbledore took in the decor of the living room behind Kyle, his guilt eased slightly. It seemed Kyle's living conditions weren't too bad. Dumbledore spoke gently, doing his best to convey goodwill. "Child, there's no need to fear. We mean you no harm." Kyle eyed the peculiar old man with half-moon glasses and the other figure behind him, who kept his face turned aside. He lowered the gun slightly. "You're not here to arrest me." "No, child, we're here to take you with us." Dumbledore took a tentative step forward, but Kyle immediately stepped back half a pace, alert. Was that half-step retreat for real? Such a small movement, yet it stung so much. Until he understood the situation, Kyle wasn't about to let anyone get close. What if this frail-looking old man was secretly a taijutsu master, capable of opening all 8 gates? Besides, anyone who could enter his hideout using his method was no ordinary person. "Take me?" Kyle asked, puzzled. Dumbledore nodded. "Child, you're a wizard." "Wizard? What a wizard?" Kyle froze, his confusion deepening. He was a ninja. Since when did he have anything to do with being a wizard? The two didn't even belong to the same world. This old man must be trying to scam him with a flimsy excuse. "Wait a second." White-bearded old man. "Wizard. It's you, Gandalf the Sword Saint." Kyle scrutinized the old man. He wasn't holding a staff in one hand and a sword in the other, though. Uncertain, Kyle asked, "What's your name?" "I'm Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in Britain." Dumbledore gestured to the man beside him, who still avoided showing his face. "This is Newt Scamander, a renowned magizoologist in the wizarding world." "Dumbledore." The room fell silent. "Kyle, a certain plant." Wasn't this a character from the movie Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone he'd watched in his previous life? When he'd crossed over, the remastered version of Philosopher's Stone had just been released. While surfing the web, he'd seen Potter fans buzzing with excitement everywhere, so out of boredom, he downloaded and watched it. He'd forgotten most of the plot, but the names Harry Potter, Albus Dumbledore, and the villain Lord Voldemort stuck with him. As for Newt Scamander, who was that? Never heard of him. But since this man could name Albus Dumbledore, he probably wasn't lying. It was 1991. Kyle didn't know exactly when the first Harry Potter book was published, but it definitely wasn't out yet. Unless J.K. Rowling herself showed up, no one else in this world could know the name Dumbledore. Slightly lowering his guard, Kyle tossed the gun aside but kept his chakra primed, ready to unleash a ninjutsu at a moment's notice. Then, politely, he invited the two into the living room to sit. Though surprised by Kyle's shift in demeanor, Dumbledore didn't dwell on it. He spoke slowly. "You must know you possess abilities beyond those of ordinary people. Hogwarts is a school dedicated to teaching young witches and wizards like you, who have magical talent." Hold on, here's the problem. Why would a British wizarding school come to recruit someone in America? This was New York, for crying out loud. Didn't America have its own wizarding schools? Surely there wasn't just one wizarding school in Britain for the whole world, right? Other countries must have their own. By that logic, If any school were to recruit him, it should be Konoha's Ninja Academy from Japan, shouldn't it? And another thing, Kyle had always assumed the energy flowing through his body was chakra. Was he wrong about that? But if so, why could he perform the Naruto ninjutsu from his memories by forming hand seals? His head swimming with questions, Kyle pushed aside his doubts about chakra versus magic for now. Why is Hogwarts in Britain recruiting me? Doesn't America have its own wizarding school? Newt ignored his question, pulling an antique pocket watch from his coat and glancing at it. The hour hand pointed to 3 in the morning. I think you'd better leave now. The Aurors from the American Ministry of Magic will be here soon, Newt said. Now, wait, what about my stuff? And what are Aurors? I'm not going anywhere until you explain, Kyle said, his guard back up. Seeing Kyle's wariness, Dumbledore sighed helplessly and began to explain. Aurors, in your Muggle terms, are like police. O and Muggle refers to people who can't use magic. The American Ministry of Magic wants to apprehend you, Dumbledore added, keeping it brief. He then drew his wand and tapped the teapot on the table. Portus. The teapot trembled, emitting a strange blue glow before settling back into its blackened state. Why are Aurors after me? I'm a law-abiding citizen, Kyle exclaimed, taken aback. Dumbledore gave a wry smile, glancing at the open safe nearby. Law-abiding citizen, where did all that money come from? Jijichi, who left all this money in my safe? That's just asking for trouble, Kyle stammered. Dumbledore cut off his poor performance. They want you because of your father. No more delays or the Aurors will arrive. Place your hand on the teapot. We're using a portkey to travel to Britain, and I'll explain more there. Safe travels, then, Newt said, waving from where he stood, clearly not intending to join them at Hogwarts. Until we meet again, Newt, Dumbledore replied. The next moment he activated the portkey. Kyle felt as if a hook had latched behind his navel, yanking him forward with irresistible force. His feet left the ground, and he was hurtling through the air like a gust of wind. His vision a blur. Thankfully, the disorienting sensation passed quickly. The moment his feet touched the ground, the blurry scene before him snapped into focus, a majestic castle. The portkey's momentum nearly sent him sprawling face first into the dirt. Fortunately, 5 years of taijutsu training made him agile. With a quick roll, he sprang to his feet and began taking in his surroundings. Towering mountains encircled the massive castle, beside which lay a vast lake, its surface shimmering under the morning sun. Occasionally, a giant tentacle-like shadow broke the water's surface. Is this where I'll be studying? Kyle marveled. Dumbledore nodded with a warm smile. Welcome to Hogwarts. Well then, Kyle, let's go, Dumbledore said, glancing at the time. We're just in time for breakfast. Dumbledore led Kyle along the elevated stone bridge, winding through the mountains toward the castle. As they walked, Kyle racked his brain, trying to recall the movie plots from his past life. According to the usual process, wasn't Hogwarts supposed to send an owl with an acceptance letter first? Why, in his case, had the headmaster himself shown up at his doorstep? Sure, his situation was a bit unusual. And what was the deal with the American wizarding Aurors trying to arrest him? Brimming with questions, Kyle spoke up. Professor, I mean headmaster. Just call me Professor, Dumbledore said, turning to Kyle with a wink and a smile. All right, Professor, Kyle said, adapting quickly. He pressed on with his burning question. Why did you say all of this has to do with my father? Dumbledore let out a soft, wistful sigh, weighing whether to reveal the truth about Kyle's origins. Kyle trailed behind, unaware of the shifting expressions on Dumbledore's face. After a brief moment of thought, Dumbledore made his decision. Do you know your surname? He asked, stopping in his tracks and turning to face Kyle. Grindelwald. That was the name he'd been given, according to the head of the orphanage where he'd been left as a baby. It had been written on a note tucked into his swaddling clothes. Kyle had no idea there was anything significant about the name. And who could blame him? In his previous life, he hadn't been particularly invested in the Harry Potter series. He'd only watched The Sorcerer's Stone and hadn't even touched the Fantastic Beasts films. So Kyle was clueless about what the name Grindelwald meant in the European wizarding world. "Your father," Dumbledore began, his voice heavy with memory, "was Gellert Grindelwald." The name seemed to pull Dumbledore into a reverie. Kyle's question snapped him back to the present. What kind of person was he? "Let's walk and talk," Dumbledore suggested. The February chill of the Scottish Highlands was biting, and the morning breeze made him shiver. A man over 100 years old wasn't exactly built for the cold. "Your father, Gellert Grindelwald, was a deeply complex man, both an idealist and extraordinarily gifted. We became friends in the summer of 1899, bonded by a shared vision of a greater purpose." Kyle blinked. 1899. He rubbed his ears, wondering if his hearing was playing tricks on him. "But later, for certain reasons, we parted ways," Dumbledore continued, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "After that, Gellert took a path that put him at odds with the law, launching a dark revolution. He sought reform outside the bounds of legality, and with his followers, he committed countless crimes. His influence spread across America and Europe. He became known as one of the most powerful dark wizards in history." Kyle opened his mouth, but words failed him. Where did he even begin? His father was over 100 years old. Okay, fine. The age gap wasn't that big a deal. The real issue was that his father was. The term terrorist felt like an insult to someone who'd once shaken the wizarding world to its core. Kyle struggled to find the right word. The world's most notorious criminal. No, stop. His father was Monkey D. Dragon, and he had no interest in becoming the Pirate King. A wizarding warlord. No, wait. His father was Madara Uchiha, and Dumbledore wasn't Hashirama Senju. Kyle reined in his runaway thoughts. "So, that's why the Aurors are after me." Dumbledore nodded. "When a young witch or wizard turns 11, their name automatically appears on the enrollment list of their local magical school. The American Magical Congress discovered you through that list. Fortunately, Mr. Scamander's wife used to work for the Congress. That's how Newt and I were able to find you before the Aurors did." Dumbledore's explanation cleared up some of Kyle's confusion. "What about my father? Where is he now? Why has he never come to find me?" As he spoke, Kyle's tone carried a trace of resentment, though he felt no real attachment to this father he'd never met. Still, who wouldn't feel bitter after being abandoned in an orphanage for years, left to fend for themselves by age 6? Even if Kyle was doing fine on his own now, he couldn't help but harbor some grudge against Gellert Grindelwald. Unbeknownst to them, they'd crossed the castle's courtyard and reached the grand entrance. Dumbledore paused at the doors, his expression tinged with sorrow. "It's not that your father didn't want to," he said softly. "He couldn't." His weathered hand rested gently on Kyle's golden hair. "In 1945, I defeated him. Since then, he's confined himself to Nurmengard, never stepping foot outside its walls." Kyle froze. So, his never-before-seen father was in prison, and the white-bearded man standing in front of him was the one who'd put him there. "What about my mother?" At the mention of mother, Kyle noticed a flicker of awkwardness on Dumbledore's face. Sensing there might be something complicated there, Kyle quickly changed the subject. "What about my identity? Will taking me in cause trouble for you?" The son of a dark wizard was a risky title. If any of his father's old enemies came knocking, it could get messy. Kyle asked the question deliberately, hoping to secure himself a protector. And who better than Dumbledore himself? To his surprise, Dumbledore's response was unexpected. "If you're willing, Your name will be registered at Hogwarts as Kyle Dumbledore. When you've grown strong enough to stand on your own, you can reclaim the Grindelwald name if you choose. Well, all right then. A new surname solved the problem, and with the Dumbledore name, he could probably strut through Hogwarts without a care in the world. I'd be honored, Professor, Kyle said with a grin. It was clear Dumbledore and his father had been incredibly close, or else the headmaster wouldn't have made such an offer. Dumbledore smiled warmly and patted Kyle's shoulder. Come, let's head to the Great Hall for breakfast. The Great Hall of Hogwarts. When Kyle and Dumbledore appeared at the entrance, the Hogwarts students were already seated at the 4 long tables. Thousands of candles floated above, illuminating the hall with a warm glow. The tables were laden with gleaming silverware and an array of mouth-watering dishes. For a mere breakfast, the spread was almost excessive. Oatmeal bread rolls, orange juice, kippers, eggs and bacon, toast, buttered scones with jam, cornflakes. Having spent years in an orphanage, Kyle had assumed foreign breakfasts were just bread with jam and a glass of milk. Clearly, the orphanage had just been too poor to afford anything better. At the far end of the hall, another long table was set for the professors. Kyle, dressed in Muggle clothing, stood out starkly against the sea of students in their wizarding robes. Feeling their curious stares, he grew uneasy. Just as he started to feel out of place, Dumbledore's gentle voice broke through. You can dine with me, or you can choose any of the house tables to sit at. Faced with a room full of unfamiliar faces and their inquisitive looks, Kyle decided sticking with Dumbledore was the safer bet. Professor, I'll stay with you, he said, hurrying to catch up. When Kyle took his seat at the staff table, a considerable stir rippled through the great hall. All the students were buzzing, discussing and speculating about Kyle's identity. What was his connection to Professor Dumbledore? Why had Professor Dumbledore brought him into the Great Hall? And why was he dining with the professors? Kyle, the subject of all this attention, paid no mind to the students' chatter. He knew his sudden appearance was bound to seem odd, but he had bigger concerns at the moment. After all, he had just arrived from New York City, where his internal clock was still set to 3 in the morning. Earlier that evening, he'd been in a warehouse, engaged in a rather intense group workout with a gang of criminals dealing in laundry detergent. He'd barely made it home, without even time to whip up a midnight snack, when Dumbledore informed him that he was the son of a criminal, currently being hunted by a squad of magical law enforcement. Then, he'd been whisked across the Atlantic to evade capture. What a colorful night it had been. Now, he was so hungry he felt he could devour 46 bowls of Ikaraku ramen. Kyle ravaged the food on the table like a starving ghost. In no time, the cycle of plates being cleared and magically refilled repeated 4 or 5 times. He was, at this moment, Kyle Payne 6 Paths, Hungry Ghost Path Grindelwald. The others at the table paused their eating, casting curious glances at Kyle, clearly wondering just how much this kid could put away. When the food on his plate vanished for the 8th time, Kyle let out a satisfied belch and finally stopped. His eyes, however, lingered on the table, searching for something. At that moment, a hand reached over, offering him a goblet of pumpkin juice. Thanks, Kyle said, turning to see who it was. The hand belonged to a professor with shoulder-length black hair, a hooked nose, and sallow skin. How should I address you? Professor Snape will do, the man replied. Professor Snape, Kyle said respectfully. He waited for a response, but none came. Unable to resist, he pressed, just Snape, like Adele or Aristotle, Drake, Bono, Why was this kid such a chatterbox? Snape's perpetually stoic face twitched slightly, and after a long pause he forced out a name through gritted teeth. Severus Snape. On the other side of the staff table, Dumbledore watched Kyle's lively exchange with Snape, a faint smile playing on his lips. It seems he's getting along rather well with Severus, which is quite surprising, Dumbledore remarked. Hearing this, a tall witch followed his gaze. Through the lenses of her square glasses, she noticed Kyle's heterochromatic eyes, strikingly identical to those of Gellert Grindelwald. Hogwarts Deputy Headmistress, Minerva McGonagall, smiled and said, "It seems his potions grades shouldn't be too shabby." "I suspect he'll inherit his father's remarkable talent," Dumbledore replied, adding silently to himself, though his father certainly wasn't this much of a glutton. The food on the table vanished entirely, signaling the end of the meal. Kyle stood up, his flat stomach betraying no sign that he'd just consumed enough food for 5 or 6 grown adults. "Professor." Before he could finish his question, Dumbledore anticipated it. "I think you should get some rest first. Once you've had a nap, I'll take you to Diagon Alley to purchase the supplies you'll need for Hogwarts." As a ninja who thrived in the shadows of New York City, Kyle felt no need for a nap. Besides, he'd already caught up on sleep during the day to prepare for last night's mission. He couldn't exactly fight gangsters while yawning, could he? "Professor, I'm not tired at all. Let's head to Diagon Alley now." Dumbledore studied Kyle for a moment, confirming that the boy was indeed brimming with energy and in high spirits. He nodded. "Very well, let's go." Moments later, Kyle and Dumbledore stood on the grassy grounds outside the castle. "Professor, can we avoid using that Porto's magic to get to Diagon Alley?" Kyle asked, tilting his head. Not long ago, Dumbledore had used a portkey to transport him across the Atlantic. The sensation of a hook yanking at his navel was something he'd rather not experience again in this lifetime. Dumbledore looked at Kyle, puzzled by his aversion to the portkey, a perfectly standard mode of magical transport. "Well, all right then, Fawkes." With Dumbledore's call, a burst of flames appeared out of thin air. A magnificent crimson bird, roughly the size of a swan, with a long, glittering golden tail, a gleaming beak and golden claws emerged from the flames, a Scottish long-tailed fire turkey. For some reason, when Kyle laid eyes on the phoenix named Fawkes, he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. "This is Fawkes, my phoenix. He'll take us to Diagon Alley," Dumbledore explained. Kyle gave Fawkes a skeptical glance. The bird was so small, could it even carry them? Was it going to grab one of them in each claw and fly them to Diagon Alley dangling in the air? Fawkes, perched on Dumbledore's shoulder, fixed Kyle with a curious stare, its large eyes glinting with suspicion. It seemed to sense that this human child was thinking something less than flattering. "Take my hand," Dumbledore instructed. Kyle complied, and in the next instant they were engulfed in a massive burst of flames, vanishing from Hogwarts. When Kyle came to his senses, they were standing in a wide archway that led to a winding, cobblestone street that stretched out of sight. "We're in Diagon Alley already?" Kyle asked, stunned. He hadn't even felt the long-distance teleportation. Traveling with Fawkes had been warm and comfortable, a far cry from the portkey's gut-wrenching pull. "Yes," Dumbledore replied. "Let's head to the bank first." As they walked through the archway, the nearest shop to the exit was Madame Malkin's cauldron shop. The morning sunlight bathed a stack of cauldrons at the entrance, making the sign above the door gleam brightly. Dumbledore noticed Kyle's gaze. "You won't need those just yet." "No, I think I need one right now," Kyle thought. His eyes locked onto a copper cauldron, perfect for cooking hot pot. In his 11 years in this world, he hadn't once tasted the culinary delights of his past life's food-obsessed empire. The thought of Sichuan hot pot spicy, numbing flavor brought nostalgic tears to Kyle's eyes, or rather his mouth, as drool began to escape. Wiping away his tears, Kyle followed Dumbledore to a towering, snow-white building that loomed over the surrounding shops. A set of white stone steps led to a pair of gleaming bronze doors, flanked by a figure in a scarlet and gold uniform, a goblin. More accurately, a Gringotts goblin. They passed through a second set of silver doors into a spacious marble hall. Around 100 goblins sat behind a long counter, scribbling in large ledgers. Some weighed coins on scales, while others examined gemstones with eyeglasses. "Esteemed Mr. Dumbledore, welcome to Gringotts. How may we assist you today?" a goblin greeted, approaching with deference as soon as he spotted Dumbledore. Dumbledore produced a key from his robes. "We'd like to visit the underground vaults, please." With impeccable courtesy, the goblin bowed and led them toward a door. "Your father left you a sizable fortune," Dumbledore explained to Kyle as they followed. 2 minutes later, Kyle was nearly blinded by the mountain of gold piled high in the vault. How much is all this?" The golden heap was practically touching the cavern's ceiling. "In truth, compared to the wealth your father possessed at the height of his power, this is but a drop in the bucket," came the reply. Kyle turned his head, dumbfounded. A drop in the bucket. Right, of course. His father had once been the supreme leader of the wizarding world, with influence spanning all of Europe. All right, fine, he was just too inexperienced. With this fortune in hand, Kyle instantly dismissed a certain audacious idea that had been brewing in his mind. Truth be told, while riding the cart through the winding tracks down to the depths of Gringotts, Kyle had been memorizing the terrain and nodding the bank's security measures. He'd even started formulating a preliminary plan, just waiting for the day he could recruit a few like-minded teammates to form the Yingjilan trio and put his scheme into action. But now, with this massive fortune, there was no need for a poor farmer's descendant like him, 3 generations deep in poverty, to take such a reckless risk. Still, it'd be so tempting to pull off a heist. "So, Professor, are we going to buy a wand now?" Standing on the street outside, Kyle fought to keep his eyes from drifting back toward Gringotts. Let's get your clothes first. Custom tailoring takes time, so we'll buy everything else and pick up the robes later." Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions was just one shop away from Gringotts, and Kyle found it easily. As he approached the entrance, voices spilled out from inside. "I think the left sleeve could be taken up a bit more, dear. Let me." "Ow," a young boy's voice yelped. "Watch it. Mind where you're sticking that needle, you daft woman. Mum, I don't want this robe." Another voice, laced with indulgence, chimed in. "You're right, Draco. Now I see what kind of riffraff shops here will find better at Twilfit and tatting." Before Kyle could push open the door, it was flung outward with force, the gust ruffling his bangs. Standing before him was a primped-up, high-quality human cub, platinum blonde hair slicked back into a neat style, his handsome face wearing a haughty expression. Just a spoiled brat, Kyle thought. He was about to step aside when the boy spoke. "Out of my way," Draco sneered, eyeing Kyle's muggle clothing. "You filthy mudblood." The insult made Kyle reconsider immediately. He didn't know what mudblood meant, but the venom in the word was clear enough. For a pampered kid like this, a taste of society's harsh lessons might do some good. Glancing back, he saw Professor Dumbledore hadn't caught up yet. Perfect. "Let's do this." Kyle narrowed his eyes, pulling a small, round object from his pocket and hurling it to the ground. With a soft pop, a burst of blinding light flashed. Draco's vision blurred, and Kyle's figure vanished from his sight. A foot appeared behind Draco out of nowhere, sending him sprawling to the ground with a swift kick. Konoha Taijutsu's secret technique. Kyle's hands formed the tiger seal, his face twisting into a wild, devilish grin. 1,000 years of death. Draco, now kneeling on the ground, felt an inexplicable tightening in a certain area the moment he heard those words. "Ude." "Draco, I'm washing seaweed, yo, tilde." A blood-curdling scream tore through the air, as a figure traced a graceful parabola through the sky. To leap that far in a frog-like crouch, Kyle mused that this brat, Draco, could probably compete in the Olympic pole vault without a pole. You, Draco whimpered, clutching an unmentionable area, his voice trembling, then breaking into sobs and finally erupting into full-on wailing. Having delivered the crippling 1,000 years of death, Kyle calmly spat out a water ball to wash his hands, then looked skyward, pretending nothing had happened. Draco, what's wrong? A blonde woman rushed out of Madame Malkin's, her eyes wide with panic. Narcissa Malfoy glared at Kyle, who was still gazing at the sky, but then her eyes fell on the elderly man standing behind him. Dumb. Kyle cut in, playing the victim. Professor, he called me a mudblood. Mrs. Malfoy, is this true? Dumbledore's gaze shifted to the sobbing boy in his mother's arms, his usually kind eyes taking on a frosty edge. Emboldened by his mother's presence, Draco, still reeling from the attack, puffed up. Look at his clothes. He's obviously a mud. Draco, Narcissa snapped, cutting off her son's reckless words. My apologies, Professor Dumbledore. He's still just a child. Standing beside Dumbledore, Kyle muttered under his breath, he'll learn better in his next life. Black lines seemed to form on Dumbledore's forehead. Next life, are you planning to kill him? Dumbledore suddenly felt Newt's warning was spot on. Hogwarts was about to get very lively. I believe young Mr. Malfoy could benefit from a lesson in proper manners, Dumbledore said, casting a glance at Draco, whose face was now flushed red from his mother's scolding. Narcissa's expression darkened further. After a curt farewell to Dumbledore, she dragged her wailing son away without looking back. Dumbledore looked down at Kyle, then at the suspicious puddle on the ground nearby. We were only a few steps apart, and you've already caused trouble. Professor, to be precise, trouble found me. Kyle pulled a homemade kunai from his ninja pouch. If I'd meant business, I'd have used this. In his mind, Kyle added silently, if I'd figured out how to make explosive tags, I might have slapped one on it too. Just like how Naruto took down Gaara. The sharp weapon was swiftly confiscated, along with his ninja pouch. Kyle looked up to see Dumbledore's face darken. Feigning innocence, Kyle blinked at him, then pointed to a shop behind Dumbledore. Oh, right, Professor, fancy some ice cream. As Kyle bounded toward Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, Dumbledore rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to wrangle a child, especially one with such destructive potential. Half an hour later, standing in front of Ollivander's wand shop, Kyle's skeptical gaze flickered between Dumbledore and the shop's weathered sign. This is the legendary cheat code emporium, wand shop. The store looked small and dilapidated, its golden sign peeling with age. The faded lettering read, Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. In the shop's window, a single wand rested on a faded purple cushion. Some things cannot be judged by appearances alone, Dumbledore said with a gentle smile. Ollivander is the finest wand maker in wizarding Britain, among the best in Europe too. Pushing open the door, Kyle stepped into the wand shop. The shop was tiny, with nothing inside but a single bench in the corner. Thousands of narrow wand boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling, each covered in a thin layer of dust. A tinkling bell chimed as they entered, and a white-haired head popped out from behind the stacks of boxes. Upon spotting the elderly man behind Kyle, the figure hurried forward with enthusiasm. Dumbledore, welcome, welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you. As for Kyle, he was momentarily overlooked. When the old man reached them, his pale, moon-like eyes, gleaming in the dim shop, finally registered Kyle's presence. Good heavens, this is. Ollivander's gaze locked onto Kyle's heterochromatic eyes, and he let out a gasp. He glanced at Dumbledore as if seeking confirmation of something. Dumbledore nodded. Yes, Ollivander, it's exactly as you suspect. Kyle's rare eyes were impossible to conceal from a wand maker who had spent a lifetime dealing with all manner of witches and wizards. His suspicions confirmed, Ollivander rubbed his hands together excitedly and pulled a silver-marked measuring tape from his pocket. "Which arm do you favor?" "My right." "From shoulder to fingertip, then wrist to elbow, shoulder to floor, knee to armpit, and finally head circumference." Ollivander measured it all. As he worked, he muttered, "Every Ollivander wand contains a core of powerful magical substance. That's the essence of it. We use unicorn hair, phoenix tail feathers, and dragon heartstrings. Every Ollivander wand is unique, as no two unicorns, dragons, or phoenixes are ever quite the same. And of course, if you use a wand meant for another witch or wizard, the results will never be as good." Kyle couldn't help but wonder if Ollivander recited this speech to every customer. Watching the old man's peculiar methods, Kyle couldn't resist asking, "Why do you need to measure all this to buy a wand?" "Because every Ollivander wand is unique," Ollivander replied. "To find the right wand for you, I must first measure your arm length, forearm, height, head circumference, and other dimensions, then select a wand based on those parameters." Hearing this explanation, Kyle thought for a moment, then extended both hands. Placing his left hand on his right arm, he gave a sharp tug, pop, and dislocated his right arm. Looking at Kyle's now elongated arm, Ollivander's face darkened instantly. Dumbledore, witnessing Ollivander's frozen smile and twitching mouth, turned away to stifle a laugh. Then, feeling a pang of sympathy, he faced them again. "Episky," Dumbledore intoned, and with a pop, Kyle's arm snapped back into place. "Sorry, sir, can we continue?" Kyle asked. Ollivander opened his mouth, his voice dry. "Oh, yes, of course." In all his years crafting and selling wands, Ollivander had seen it all, or so he thought. This was a first. Snapping out of it, Ollivander retrieved a box from the shelves and handed Kyle a wand. "Cherry wood, unicorn hair, 13 inches. Give it a wave." It seemed Ollivander had no intention of indulging in further unnecessary chatter. Kyle gave the wand a casual flick, and suddenly he felt a surge of magic within him, itching to burst free. Following the impulse, he released his control over his magic. A bolt of lightning shot from the wand's tip, blasting a shelf behind Ollivander, along with several wand boxes, into smithereens. Kyle bloody hell. Ollivander, Merlin's beard. Staring at the wreckage, both Kyle and Ollivander couldn't help but curse inwardly. Kyle worried the old man might demand compensation, while Ollivander mourned his losses. Ollivander looked pleadingly at Dumbledore. "Dumbledore, this." Dumbledore understood. Only he could set things right. With a wave of his wand, the shop seemed to rewind. Shattered shelves, wands, and boxes flew back into place, restored to their original state. Both the old man and the boy let out sighs of relief. Ollivander snatched the wand from Kyle's hand and thrust another into it. "Try this one. Willow, phoenix tail feather, 12 inches. Don't wave it, just a gentle flick," Ollivander shouted, panic-stricken, as Kyle raised the wand again. Amused by Ollivander's reaction, Kyle ignored the warning and gave the wand a vigorous wave, though this time he restrained his magical output. Ollivander flinched violently. Another bolt of lightning shot from the wand, grazing Ollivander's scalp and striking the cabinet behind him. Thankfully, the cabinet didn't explode into pieces this time. Ollivander, however, was scared half to death. Calming himself, he fumbled in some corner and pulled out a mirror, staring mournfully at his now even more pronounced bald spot. "Sorry, Mr. Ollivander," Kyle said. No, it's fine. A bit of hairy growth potion will fix it," Ollivander replied with a forced smile. If it weren't for the formidable figure backing this troublesome kid, Ollivander swore he'd show him why the flowers outside bloomed so red. "It seems this wand isn't quite right for you either," Ollivander said, producing a third wand. Walnut dragon heartstring 11 inches. Unlike the previous wands, the moment Kyle grasped this one, a strange sensation washed over him. It felt as if the wand was an extension of himself, as if they were one. No longer restraining his magic, he gave the wand a gentle wave. A stream of water materialized from thin air, twisting and reshaping in the air as Kyle waved the wand like a conductor's baton. Remarkable, I've never seen anything like this, Ollivander said, staring at Kyle's heterochromatic eyes. This is the one. Half an hour later, the two emerged from Flourish and Blots. Dumbledore glanced at Aelip's Owl Emporium nearby before turning to Kyle. Your wand and books are sorted. Shall we get you a pet next? Kyle's eyes lit up. A pet? Can I get a phoenix like Fawkes? I'm afraid not. Phoenixes are exceedingly rare magical creatures. But we can get you an owl. Kyle's sparkling eyes dimmed instantly. If he couldn't have a cool phoenix as a pet, what was the point of an owl? He didn't want an owl. He wanted a crow to channel his inner Itachi Uchiha. So Kyle strode boldly into the Owl Emporium. When he came out, he was holding a birdcage with a pitch-black crow inside. Kyle stroked his chin. You'll be called 1 versus 7. Dumbledore chuckled, his bright blue eyes twinkling as he watched the excited Kyle. Let's head to Madame Malkin's to pick up your robes. That's the last thing on our list. But Kyle didn't follow. Instead, his eager gaze fixed on the cauldron shop in the distance. Professor, I'd like to buy a cauldron. With permission granted, Kyle shoved the birdcage into Dumbledore's hands and dashed to the shop. He scooped up the copper cauldron he'd had his eye on, paid for it with a grin, and rejoined Dumbledore. By the time they finished shopping in Diagon Alley, the sun was high overhead. We've missed lunch at Hogwarts, Dumbledore said, checking the time. Now dressed in wizard robes, Kyle examined his new copper cauldron. Professor, does Hogwarts have a kitchen? Of course, our meals don't appear out of thin air. Why do you ask? Swallowing hard, Kyle looked at Dumbledore with anticipation. Let's go back to Hogwarts, to the kitchen. Let me treat you to a magical dish from the East. Dumbledore agreed with a cheerful laugh, curious to see what Kyle had in store. Come on, we'll use apparition to get back to Hogwarts. Grabbing Dumbledore's arm, Kyle felt himself squeezed into a tight ball, as if stuffed into a toilet and flushed through the pipes. When he came to, he was standing on Hogwarts grounds. Is that teleportation magic? Kyle almost said flying thunder god technique. You could say that, Dumbledore replied. Professor, I want to learn that. Kyle's eyes turned into starry sparkles. That magic is a bit advanced for you right now. Let's tackle lunch first. 20 minutes later, they were in the Hogwarts kitchen, a vast room with a high ceiling, as large as the great hall above. Copper pots and pans gleamed along the stone walls, and a massive brick fireplace dominated one end. 4 tables stood in the kitchen, arranged exactly like the house tables in the great hall. Kyle and Dumbledore sat across from each other, a steaming copper cauldron between them. Under a ghostly blue flame, the bright red broth bubbled, sending up spicy steam. Kyle dipped a slice of beef into the pot, swished it briefly, and placed it on Dumbledore's plate. Professor, please try it. The spicy aroma of the hot pot hit Dumbledore's nose, its tantalizing scent making him salivate. But the pile of chili peppers and Sichuan peppercorns Kyle had tossed into the pot made him hesitate. Albus Dumbledore would rather starve, jump off the astronomy tower, or die outside than eat a single bite from this pot. But seeing Kyle's hopeful expression, Dumbledore couldn't bear to refuse. With a resigned sigh, he picked up his knife and fork, took a bite of the beef, and braced himself. The next second, his tightly shut eyes flew open. Delicious. I'm curious where you learned about this dish, Dumbledore said. Brooklyn's not far from New York's Chinatown, Kyle replied, popping another slice of beef into his mouth. He sighed inwardly, wishing Hogwarts' kitchen had tripe. After a few more slices, Dumbledore set down his utensils and sipped from a goblet of chilled wine. This level of spice is a bit much for a 100-year-old man. Kyle. Fine, eat the clear broth then. Staring at the cauldron, Kyle's hand slowly formed a hand sign, way. A puff of white smoke rose, and the cauldron transformed into a mandarin duck pot, with the spicy red broth now confined to one side. Wandless transfiguration. Dumbledore was momentarily surprised by Kyle's talent, but quickly regained his composure. Grindelwald's son, basic stuff, don't overreact. With that thought, Dumbledore calmly summoned a house elf working in the kitchen to fill the other half of the pot with clear broth. House elves were small creatures with bat-like ears, bulging eyes the size of tennis balls, and long, flat noses. An ancient race conquered by wizards, they were trained from birth to serve, generation after generation. The hot pot Kyle and Dumbledore were enjoying had been prepared by these house elves under Kyle's guidance. Professor, once I've got my wand and books, am I officially enrolled? Will I attend classes with the other students? Kyle asked. Dumbledore, busy with the hot pot, chewed thoughtfully and shook his head. After swallowing, he explained, the school year is already well underway. If you join now, you struggle to catch up. You'll officially enroll in September with the next batch of first years. Can I audit the professor's classes in the meantime? Kyle asked. Dumbledore swallowed another bite. Auditing should be fine. He pulled a piece of parchment from his robes and handed it to Kyle. This is the first-year timetable. I recommend starting with Professor Flitwick's Charms class, then Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration. Their current lessons might be a bit advanced for you, but they'll still be valuable. If you have any questions about magic, you can find me in the headmaster's office on the 8th floor. The password is Fizzing Whizbees. Kyle took the parchment and studied it closely. The timetable listed schedules for all 4 houses, Gryffindor and Hufflepuff on one side, Slytherin and Ravenclaw on the other. Kyle remembered from the movies he'd seen in his past life that Harry Potter, the protagonist, and that arrogant kid he'd put in his place in Diagon Alley today were from Gryffindor and Slytherin, respectively. He could have sworn the movies showed Gryffindor and Slytherin sharing classes often. But when he checked the timetable again, the 2 rival houses only shared potions and flying lessons. Don't ask, the movies changed the setting. All 4 houses had charms and transfiguration that afternoon, just in different orders. Kyle was more intrigued by charms than transfiguration. He decided to audit Ravenclaw's charms class first. After finishing lunch, Kyle suddenly realized that Dumbledore hadn't assigned him a dormitory. He glanced at the pile of luggage stacked on the floor beside the table and asked, "Professor, where's my dormitory?" "Your dormitory has already been arranged. You'll be staying with the Gryffindor students," Dumbledore replied. "Your name is written on the doorplate. This evening, just follow the Gryffindor students, and they'll lead you to the common room." Following Kyle's gaze, Dumbledore noticed the pile of luggage. "As for your belongings, I'll have a house elf take them to your dormitory later." "Thank you, Professor," Kyle said, pulling 2 textbooks from the pile. "I'll head to class now." When the 2 left the kitchen, there were only about 10 minutes left before the first afternoon class. Dumbledore kindly asked Kyle if he needed someone to show him the way. But Kyle felt confident he could manage on his own and politely declined Dumbledore's offer. However, the moment he stepped out of the kitchen and faced the labyrinthine structure of Hogwarts Castle, Kyle immediately regretted his decision. Hogwarts had a staggering 142 staircases. Some were wide and grand, others were narrow, cramped, and rickety. Some led to different destinations every Friday. On certain staircases, a step might vanish halfway up, forcing you to remember where to jump. Worse still, the staircases constantly shifted positions. You might intend to head to the right corridor, only for the staircase to deposit you on the left. Then there were the doors. Some wouldn't open unless you asked politely or poked them in exactly the right spot. Others weren't doors at all, just solid walls disguised as entrances. Without a guide, Kyle doubted he could make it from here to the Charms classroom on the 4th floor in just 10 minutes. Dumbledore stood nearby, smiling serenely, clearly waiting for Kyle to ask for help. But Kyle had already bragged about handling it himself. How could he back down now? So Kyle abandoned the idea of taking the conventional route. 2 minutes later, he stood on the lawn outside the castle, eyeing the outer walls as if searching for something. Dumbledore, arms crossed, watched from a distance, curious to see what outrageous stunt Kyle would pull. In the next moment, Dumbledore's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Kyle sprinted toward the castle wall, and just before impact, he kicked off the ground, leaping high. His feet hit the wall and he began running up it. The vertical surface was no obstacle for Kyle. He moved as if it were flat ground. Dumbledore. What kind of magic was this? If Kyle could hear Dumbledore's thoughts, he'd probably say basic stuff, don't get too excited. By channeling chakra, or rather, magic, to the soles of his feet, he could adhere to surfaces, allowing him to climb vertical trees or cliffs. In Konohagakure, this was a skill every ninja mastered. Climbing walls, child's play, he could even walk on water. Ever since he'd imagined his magic as chakra, the first training Kyle had undertaken was tree climbing and water walking. To him, this was nothing worth bragging about. Soon Kyle reached the 4th floor. Clinging to the outer wall, he peered through a few windows until he spotted Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher Dumbledore had mentioned. Phileas Flitwick was unmistakable. Strictly speaking, he wasn't a pure human wizard. His part-goblin ancestry explained his notably short stature. Climbing through the window into the classroom didn't seem like the best idea. Kyle didn't want his first day at Hogwarts to make him the center of attention, so he scrapped that plan. After scaling a bit farther along the wall, he hopped into an empty corridor and quickly located the Charms classroom door. Just then, the crisp sound of the class bell rang out. Kyle hurried into the classroom and slid into an empty seat in the back row. Professor Flitwick stood atop a stack of books, otherwise the lectern would have obscured him entirely. Clearing his throat, he smiled at the young witches and wizards. This lesson will be learning the cutting charm. Flitwick had noticed Kyle dash into the classroom, but didn't alter his lesson plan for the son of Grindelwald. He proceeded with teaching the cutting charm as scheduled. Kyle quickly flipped his newly purchased standard spells, grade 1 to the relevant page. With a wave of Flitwick's wand, a pile of small wooden sticks on the lectern floated up, drifting precisely to each student's desk, including Kyle's. I'll demonstrate once. Pay close attention to the incantation and wand movement, Flitwick said. He recited the cutting charm's incantation, gave a gentle flick of his wrist, and the stick in front of him snapped cleanly in two. After explaining some precautions and common mistakes for beginners, Flitwick announced, "Now, practice on your own." Kyle, that's it. What about the spell's casting principles? How does the magic function during the cutting process? How do you control where the cut lands? He just moved on. Skeptical but determined, Kyle mimicked Flitwick's movements, reciting the incantation precisely and waving his wand. The stick in front of him, completely unaffected. After several futile attempts, Kyle felt like a baboon waving a stick. Just then the dark-haired girl beside him turned her head. "Hi, I'm Cho Chang." Kyle paused, taking in her appearance. She was likely of Asian descent, probably Chinese. Suddenly, a bold idea struck him. "Chinese?" he asked. Cho nodded. Well, Chinese descent to be precise. Do you know Chinese martial arts? Like Bruce Lee, Kyle threw a few punches into the air. He could barely contain his laughter. A few black lines seemed to form on Cho's forehead. She looked mildly offended. After firmly denying any knowledge of martial arts, she finally asked the question she'd been holding back. What's your relationship with Professor Dumbledore? This morning in the Great Hall, you two seemed pretty close. That question. Kyle himself wasn't entirely sure what his relationship with Dumbledore was. By family ties, should he call Dumbledore uncle or great-uncle? Did that mean most of the Hogwarts professors were technically his juniors? Better to let her figure it out herself. Kyle extended his hand to Cho. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Kyle Dumbledore. Cho let out an incredulous gasp. Dumbledore. From Cho's other side, a girl with reddish-blonde hair turned around. The Dumbledore, as in Professor Dumbledore's Dumbledore. Well, he should have expected this reaction. Hi, I'm Marietta Edgecombe from Ravenclaw, the girl said, confidently offering her hand. As Kyle reached to shake it, a cough sounded beside their table. Cho Chang and Marietta Edgecombe, as Ravenclaw students, found it deeply embarrassing to be caught slacking off in class by their own head of house. The two quickly turned back around, pretending to be diligent, studious pupils, and began practicing the cutting charm on their wooden sticks. Kyle, on the other hand, showed no trace of embarrassment. He boldly approached Professor Flitwick to ask about the principles behind the cutting charm. Professor, I don't quite understand. Why is it that just reciting the incantation and waving the wand can produce the cutting charm? As he spoke, Kyle glanced at the wooden stick in Cho Chang's hand beside him. It had already been neatly sliced in two. Meanwhile, the stick in Kyle's hand remained exactly as it had been when it was handed out. Before Professor Flitwick could respond, Kyle hurriedly continued. From a literal perspective, the cutting charm is about splitting an object apart. From a physical standpoint, it's as if you're using a sharp object, like a knife, to cut it. Professor Flitwick listened with a smile. But when I watched you and Cho perform the cutting charm, I didn't sense anything like a knife cutting through. It's as if the object splits apart on its own from within. Professor Flitwick's smile widened. So, does that mean the true principle of the cutting charm is to use magical energy to act on the molecules of the stick, disrupting the attractive forces between them, or pushing them beyond their binding range, thus achieving the cutting effect? Professor Flitwick's smile froze. How should I control my magical energy to achieve this effect? Professor Flitwick. What in the world is this kid asking? Every word, every letter Kyle said made sense individually, but strung together, Flitwick had no idea what Kyle was talking about. Did a basic spell like the cutting charm really require this much overthinking? Wasn't it just a matter of waving your wand, chanting the spell, and bam, the thing gets cut? Professor Flitwick was indeed a charms master, but his research into spells certainly didn't involve analyzing them from the perspective of Muggle physics. Still, for the sake of his dignity as a professor, he couldn't let himself be stumped by a student. Flitwick put on a serious expression, which to Kyle looked like he was deep in thought, carefully choosing his words. After a futile internal struggle, Flitwick gave up. He forced a dry smile. That's the power of magic. You simply need to channel your intent into your wand and command it to cast the spell. Kyle stared at Flitwick. Are you serious? Flitwick stared back at Kyle. Why is this kid looking at me like that? Is he questioning my expertise as a charms master? A crow flew past the window, cawing twice, amplifying the awkward atmosphere surrounding them. A few black lines seemed to slide down Kyle's forehead. This magic is way too idealistic, isn't it? When he performed water-release ninjutsu, there was a clear process to follow. His magical energy transformed into water elements, which he then shaped into, say, a shark. That was the so-called big spit, no, the great shark bullet. Whether that process adhered to the law of conservation of energy or other physical principles, Kyle wasn't sure, but at least it was traceable. The cutting charm, though, it was just inexplicable. Kyle carefully chose his words before finally asking the crux of the matter. So, Professor, is the essence of magic just making your wishes come true? Professor Flitwick's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, exactly. You've summed it up perfectly. If that's the case. Kyle picked up his wand again, aiming it at the wooden stick on the table in front of him. He slowly channeled his magical energy into the wand. At the same time, he sent a powerful intention to his wand. Cut it. Kyle felt the magic within him surge wildly into the wand, as if it were about to drain him dry. Thankfully, the drain stopped quickly. A dazzling beam of light shot from the tip of his wand, striking the stick. Its momentum didn't stop there. It continued onto the wooden table beneath. A brilliant red glow enveloped the entire table. Crack! The table, now split in two, crashed to the floor. Thud! The sound of books hitting the ground followed. Kyle stared blankly at the desk. What just happened? Snapping out of it, he scrambled to prop up the table while quietly asking Professor Flitwick, "Professor, does this mean my cutting charm was a success?" A success? It was beyond a success. This cutting charm rivaled Snape's Sectum Sempra. Flitwick wiped non-existent sweat from his brow. "I think you might not have controlled your magical output properly. Don't be discouraged. Let's try again. Reparo." The desk Kyle was holding reassembled itself under the Reparo spell, fitting back together seamlessly, as if it hadn't just been cleaved in half. Kyle couldn't help but marvel at the wonders of magic. After summoning another wooden stick, with Flitwick's encouragement, Kyle began his second casting attempt. He reflected on the mistake he'd made during his first try. When he had channeled his intent into the wand, he felt his magical energy mobilize on its own, much like the sensation he'd experienced earlier that day at the wand shop. Judging by Ollivander's reaction, the professional wand maker, Kyle's magical reserve seemed far larger than most. In other words, while others had chakra, he had kilograms or even tons of chakra. That must be why his spell was so much more powerful than others. If that was the case, he needed to rein in his magical energy when casting spells, ensuring it didn't pour out uncontrollably. Otherwise, with a cutting charm like the one he just cast, if it hit a person, the whole school might be holding a feast for the wrong reasons. With this realization, Kyle tried the cutting charm again. After 3 or 4 more attempts, he finally managed to control the spell's power to a level comparable to that of an average wizard. Professor Flitwick nodded in approval. To master the cutting charm in a single class period, without any prior training in wand movements or incantation techniques, was an astonishing feat. What terrifying talent! Having grasped the cutting charm, Kyle began to ponder Flitwick's earlier words. If the essence of magic was making wishes come true, could he define the cutting charm's effect differently by altering the intent he sent to his wand? Could he make it manifest in a new way? An idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. Kyle switched from holding his wand with one hand to both hands. As he infused it with magic and intent, an invisible blade of magical energy extended from the wand's tip. "Death is like the wind, always by my side. The path is long, with only my sword as my companion." Grabbing the wooden stick and tossing it upward, Kyle closed his eyes, sensing the flow of air as the stick fell. In that moment, he felt like the wind swordsman himself. In that moment, he was Hogwarts' joyful wind man. As the stick in free fall descended before him, he moved. Face the wind. Draw/sheath. Hasik. The falling stick was sliced cleanly in two by the wind-like flash of his strike, landing powerlessly on the table. Thud. Flitwick looked at the stick, its cut surface smooth and precise, then at the invisible blade extending from Kyle's wand. His face twitched. Is this the cutting charm? Is this the cutting charm? Even Snape's Sectumsempra wasn't this outrageous. Kyle was still basking in the thrill of mastering the happiness charm, and before he knew it, the class period had slipped away. The trio quickly packed up their textbooks and wands, dashing out into the corridor outside the classroom. "Kyle, are you coming with us to Transfiguration?" Marietta asked. She noticed the Transfiguration textbook in Kyle's hand. "Yeah, but you'll have to show me the way to the classroom. I don't know where it is." The Transfiguration classroom was on the second floor of the castle. Even with two seasoned fifth-month castle veterans leading the way, the journey from the fourth floor to the second took nearly 20 minutes. Kyle couldn't help but wonder if he'd hopped into one of those shady cabs that take the long route. He mused to himself, if I just jumped down the stairs, would Cho and Marietta have to serve time in Azkaban? When the three finally arrived at the Transfiguration classroom, Professor Minerva McGonagall was already waiting. Professor McGonagall wore square glasses, her dark hair coiled into a tight, high bun, and a deep green robe draped over her frame. The moment Kyle saw her stern, no-nonsense face, he instantly thought of his high school principal from his past life. Not just similar, identical. As the class bell rang, Professor McGonagall spoke. Transfiguration is the most complex and dangerous subject taught at Hogwarts. Anyone who dares to misbehave in my classroom will be asked to leave and never return. As she said this, her eyes deliberately flicked toward Kyle, who was seated in the front row. Kyle was certain her words were directed at him, probably because Professor Flitwick tipped her off, he thought. Meeting Professor McGonagall's piercing gaze through her square glasses, Kyle, ever the bold one, didn't flinch. Instead, he stared back with equal intensity. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Professor McGonagall's lips. It had been years since she'd seen a student this audacious. With a flick of her wand, she tapped the podium beside her. In an instant, the podium transformed into a majestic, roaring lion, its deafening bellow aimed directly at Kyle before it lunged forward. Startled, Kyle instinctively kicked out with tremendous force. The heavy wooden desk in front of him shot forward at an astonishing speed, propelled by sheer power, and slammed into the posturing lion with bone-rattling force. Water release, great shark bullet technique. A massive torrent of water surged from Kyle's mouth, morphing midair into a ferocious shark with a gaping, tooth-filled maw. The water shark chased down the lion, which had been sent flying by the desk, and with one vicious bite, obliterated its head. Boom! Boom! The headless lion's body and the heavy desk crashed into the wall in quick succession, producing two dull, thunderous thuds. The desk shattered into splinters, while the lion slowly reverted to its original form, a podium. Why was there a chunk missing from the podium now? Crack. A web of countless cracks spread rapidly across the aged, antique podium. Moments later, it collapsed into a pile of fragments, lying silently on the floor as if accusing someone of its destruction. Professor McGonagall. The entire class. Kyle. Professor, this wasn't my fault, you started it. Professor McGonagall, now drenched from the exploded great shark bullet, wore a face as dark as a storm cloud. Kyle looked nervously at the furious professor. Am I about to get kicked out of class? He might just be the first Hogwarts student in history to be expelled from a classroom before even officially enrolling. Professor McGonagall took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She reminded herself that this wasn't entirely Kyle's fault. After all, She had wanted to show off the intricacies of transfiguration in front of him first. But as her gaze swept over the pile of debris in the corner and the large puddle of water on the floor, her face twitched again, her composure slipping. Grindelwald's son, what kind of little monster is he? The strength Kyle had displayed when he kicked that desk was probably comparable to a troll's. And that magic she'd never seen before. Professor McGonagall shook her head, forcing herself to stop dwelling on it. Squeezing out a strained smile, she cast a spell to dry her clothes, repaired the desk and podium, and began her lesson. Kyle let out a sigh of relief. Good, good. Professor McGonagall isn't going to make a fuss. For the rest of the class, Kyle sat upright, listening attentively and quietly as Professor McGonagall explained how to transform a mouse into a goblet. Unfortunately, he couldn't understand a single thing she said. 10 minutes later, he still hadn't learned anything. It made sense. His classmates had been studying transfiguration for over 5 months, and he was completely behind. Kyle's thoughts began to wander, drifting back to an important piece of information he'd gleaned from Professor Flitwick's class earlier. The essence of magic is to make your thoughts reality. If that was true, could he perform other elemental techniques beyond water release and earth release? He had initially thought the power within him was chakra, limited to water and earth attributes. But in reality, it wasn't chakra at all, it was magic. And most importantly, magic was attributeless. If that was the case, then techniques like ice release, crystal release, dust release, boil release, or storm release, any bloodline limit that didn't rely on a specific physical trait, might be possible, right? He'd have to find a chance to test that theory. And that kick earlier, when he'd lashed out, he'd instinctively channeled a massive amount of magic into his leg. Was that the technique behind unmatched strength? As Kyle carefully recalled the moment he'd been startled by the lion and the reflexive flow of magic in his body, a matchstick floated to his desk. Professor McGonagall's voice sounded beside him. When I taught their first transfiguration lesson, I started them with turning a matchstick into a needle. Kyle looked up at Professor McGonagall, listening intently as she explained the basic theories of transfiguration. As a complete novice in the subject, Kyle found her explanations fascinating. He knew she was teaching this specifically for him. Pay attention. When performing transfiguration, a firm and decisive wand movement is crucial. With a wave of her wand, the matchstick in front of Kyle transformed instantly into a gleaming silver embroidery needle. The needle reverted to its original form. Now, try it yourself, Professor McGonagall said to Kyle. At her words, Kyle eagerly drew his wand. Performing transfiguration should be similar to casting a cutting charm. Both required channeling intent through the wand. If he could form a clear mental image of the desired result, the transfiguration was more likely to succeed. Focusing intensely on the image of the silver needle Professor McGonagall had just conjured, Kyle lightly tapped the matchstick with the tip of his wand. In the next second, the matchstick transformed into the exact silver needle he'd envisioned. Wandless casting. Professor McGonagall's pupils contracted. She suddenly realized that when she demonstrated the match-to-needle transformation for Kyle, she'd forgotten to tell him to recite the incantation. She herself had used silent casting, a skill built on her profound mastery of transfiguration. With her level of expertise, she could perform most transformations silently or even wandlessly, as long as they weren't overly complex. But she hadn't expected Kyle to pull it off too. And on his first try, she had to admit he was truly the son of a Dark Lord. Though Gellert Grindelwald's forte wasn't transfiguration but dark magic, his skill in transfiguration was still formidable, especially considering his connection with Albus Dumbledore, the greatest transfiguration master of their time. If this young Grindelwald had inherited his father's magical talent, his success on the first attempt wasn't entirely surprising. Still, it was infuriating. When McGonagall had learned Transfiguration, she'd managed to turn a matchstick into a needle within a day, but only after hours of relentless practice. And Kyle, the more she thought about it, the more exasperated she felt. The end of the second afternoon class signaled the start of dinner time at Hogwarts Castle. Kyle and the two girls made their way to the first floor of the castle, chatting and laughing all the while. For now, Kyle was just an auditor. He hadn't officially enrolled and didn't yet belong to any house. So when they entered the Great Hall, Cho Chang and Marietta invited him to join them at the Ravenclaw table for the meal. But Kyle politely declined. Maybe it was because, in his previous life, he'd been a lifelong singleton. Eating with two girls would make him feel just a little awkward. And if he did, he wouldn't feel comfortable letting loose and stuffing his face. So, eating at the Ravenclaw table was out of the question. Kyle figured it would be much more relaxing to dine with Professor Snape. As Kyle passed the Gryffindor long table, two red-haired students blocked his path. "Hey, new guy. You're the kid who caused a ruckus in Professor McGonagall's class, right?" Their tone was unfriendly, like they were looking for trouble. Great. Beating up classmates on his first day of school, he'd probably be the first in Hogwarts history. Noticing the commotion, people from the nearby tables turned to watch, eager for a spectacle. Kyle's hand, tucked in his pocket, clenched around a kunai before relaxing. It was just ordinary schoolyard bullying. Using a kunai might turn it into a criminal case. "Yeah, that's me," Kyle replied, his voice laced with hostility. "What do you want?" The redhead on the left leaned in. "I'll tell you what I want. We want to invite you to join us tomorrow for Professor Snape's class." The boy on the right suddenly switched from a scowl to a grin. The tense atmosphere vanished in an instant, replaced by a light-hearted one. The two, instantly familiar, slung their arms around Kyle's shoulders from either side. "I'm George Weasley." As soon as the left one spoke, the right one punched him. "Get lost, I'm George. He's Fred Weasley." They looked completely identical. It was obvious they were twins. Pulled to sit at the Gryffindor long table, Kyle nodded at them. "I'm Kyle Dumbledore." Gasps erupted around them. He'd heard that reaction several times during his 2 afternoon classes. "George, Professor Dumbledore's relative." "Fred, no wonder you were eating at the staff table this morning." Across the table, 2 more boys with fiery red hair reached out their hands. "Hi, I'm Percy Weasley," said the one wearing glasses. "Charlie Weasley," said the other, whose face was covered in freckles, keeping it short. Percy pointed at George and Fred. "I'm their older brother." From the hair color alone, it was clear they were all family. With Percy and Charlie leading the way, the surrounding Gryffindor students eagerly extended hands of friendship. Kyle had underestimated the weight the Dumbledore name carried among Hogwarts students, especially in Gryffindor. After all, Albus Dumbledore, the greatest white wizard in the magical world today, had been a Gryffindor. What should have been a pleasant dinner turned into a full-blown fan meet-and-greet. The neighboring Ravenclaw table noticed the commotion too. Beside Cho, a beautiful witch with long, curly brown hair asked, "Who's that boy?" Cho pointed at Kyle, surrounded by the crowd. His name's Kyle Dumbledore." "Dumbledore." It was actually a Dumbledore. Penelope Clearwater silently committed the name to memory. Once the crowd finally dispersed, Kyle felt his face stiff from smiling. "Want to come to class with us tomorrow? We've got potions with Professor Snape. We've been fed up with that old bat for ages. He's always picking on Gryffindors." The twins extended another invitation, clearly impressed by Kyle's guts in McGonagall's class. Across the table, Percy Could you two watch what you say with people around? A thick darkness silently approached. Unable to stand it, Percy coughed violently, frantically winking at his younger brothers. Percy, you okay? Something in your eye? The twins took turns asking, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Kyle sensed something and turned to look behind him. A black wall blocked his view. He looked up, and a gloomy face continuously radiating dark energy came into sight. Holy crap, speak of Snape and Snape appears. The sudden bat-like figure startled Kyle so much he nearly jumped, but he quickly composed himself. It wasn't him bad-mouthing the professor. What did he have to be scared of? George and Fred finally caught on. They swallowed hard in terror, necks stiffly twisting. When their eyes met Snape's icy, deathly glare, the two thudded straight down beneath their seats. Disrespecting a professor, 10 points from each of you. With that cold remark, Snape flicked his robes and turned on his heel. Only after Snape left did a weak voice emerge from under the table. Kyle, give me a hand. My legs are jelly. Though a minor mishap occurred before the meal, it did nothing to dampen their spirits while eating. The dinner table is a great place to bond quickly, and soon Kyle was laughing and chatting with the twins. At the staff table nearby, Dumbledore gazed toward the Gryffindor table, a pleased smile on his face. It seemed there was no need to worry about Kyle making friends at Hogwarts. After dinner, Kyle blended into the Gryffindor crowd, following George, Fred, and the others toward the Gryffindor common room. Are you staying with us, Kyle? George asked curiously, seeing him tag along. Yeah, Professor Dumbledore arranged a room for me. Kyle followed the twins through the noisy throng, climbing the marble staircase. Finally, they stopped at the end of the 8th floor corridor, in front of a portrait of a very plump woman in a pink dress. Password, she asked. Nirvana, Percy said. The portrait swung forward with a wobble, revealing a round hole in the wall. They all climbed through. And just like that, they were in the Gryffindor common room. It was a cozy, circular room filled with squashy armchairs. There was a notice board plastered with school announcements, various ads and posters. Through the windows, the school grounds were visible outside. A large fireplace dominated one wall, decorated with scarlet tapestries depicting wizards, witches, and all sorts of animals. Back in the common room, George and Fred immediately claimed a table, expertly pulling a box from underneath it. Want to play wizard's chess? They invited Kyle. But Kyle hadn't even seen what his room looked like yet. How could he be in the mood for chess? No thanks, Kyle shook his head. I want to check out my room first. Can we come see it too? They lived in the Gryffindor boys' dormitory and knew every inch of the place by heart. But would the room Dumbledore arranged for Kyle be different from theirs, maybe more luxurious? They were genuinely curious. Kyle easily spotted the nameplate with his own name on one of the doors. Pushing it open and stepping inside, the first thing that caught his eye was the floor carpeted in gold and red tones, and a large bed with 4 posters draped in deep red velvet curtains. In the center of the room sat a modest wooden table, atop which was a golden birdcage. Raven 1 through 7 stood quietly inside, calmly preening their feathers. 3 plush armchairs encircled the wooden table, matching the style of those in the common room outside. A wide desk was placed against the right wall, with parchment, quills, and ink bottles all neatly arranged on the clean solid wood surface. All the textbooks he'd bought that morning in Diagon Alley were stacked tidily on a shelf above the desk. On the opposite wall, flames danced continuously in the fireplace, providing a steady stream of warmth to the room. This is a single room. Professor Dumbledore is way too good to you. We're all in 5-person dorms. You have no idea how unbearable George's snoring is at night. Bullshit, as if you don't snore. The Weasley twins started bickering again. Kyle noticed a brownish suitcase on the nightstand with a piece of parchment attached. Written on it in elegant cursive was a single line. "I think you'll like what's inside the suitcase." As expected, it was Professor Dumbledore's handwriting. The suitcase opened to reveal a long staircase, confirming Kyle's suspicion. He set the suitcase on the floor and stepped inside. Watching Kyle vanish into the suitcase, the twins exclaimed in unison, "Cool." At the bottom of the stairs sat a brand new 1987 Buick GNX, and that all too familiar iron door proved Kyle's guess right. This was his base, his pocket dimension. Hold on. Dumbledore had moved his base here. How was he supposed to drive the car out? "Cool, Kyle, is that a car?" Before Kyle could answer, Fred continued, "Dad, been secretly saving up lately, hiding it from Mom to buy a second-hand Muggle car. Never thought I'd see one here with you." "I remember him saying he'd modify it with a broomstick's flight system," George said, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Buying a second-hand car to mod. What a waste, why buy a used one?" After a moment's thought, Kyle offered a suggestion. "I recall there's a tank graveyard in Northumberland National Park, in the Otterburn Ranges in northern England." "A tank graveyard, what's that?" George and Fred exchanged glances, seeing nothing but question marks in each other's eyes. "A tank is a vehicle used by Muggle armies. Think of it as a military version of a car. At the tank graveyard, you can pick up a lot of tank hulls. Your dad just needs to buy an engine and install it, and it'll run. Oh, the engine for a car is like the flight system for a broomstick. This is way cheaper than buying a whole second-hand Muggle car." Seeing their eyes still glued to his car, Kyle waved them over. "Enough about that, come in and sit. My place is pretty big. We can play video games, and when we're tired, we can just crash." He pulled open the iron door and walked inside. Fred and George followed into the living room and lost it the moment they saw the pile of Muggle appliances. Dad would go nuts if he saw all this Muggle stuff. He loves Muggle things the most. Seeing them gawking like they'd never left the wizarding world, Kyle felt a small surge of vanity. He grabbed 2 cans of beer from the kitchen fridge and tossed them over. "Welcome to the Muggle world." Half an hour later. "Awesome, this is awesome." A drunken George sprawled half across the sofa, waving his arms wildly. Empty cans littered the floor around his feet. He'd clearly had quite a few. Kyle pointed at the tipsy George and laughed. "Look at this guy, just a few cans and he's wasted. What a lightweight." "This George is such a lightweight," Fred chimed in. "You're talking like you're some tough guy." "Are you kidding? I'm super tough, I can drink like a champ." Hearing that, Kyle slapped Fred's thigh. "Super tough, huh? Real brave." Suddenly remembering something, Kyle stood and said to Fred, "I've got some good stuff in my room. Wanna check it out?" "Good stuff? What is it, Kyle? Like wizard's chess or something?" "Way more exciting than wizard's chess. You'll see." Fred struggled to his feet and followed Kyle into his room in the pocket dimension. He saw a red and white Muggle machine on the table by the bed, connected to a square, weird-looking box. On the other side of the room stood 2 huge upright cabinet machines. He had no idea what they were for. Kyle sat on the bed, grabbed a cartridge, slotted it into the red and white console, and beckoned Fred over. "This is a Muggle game console," he said, shoving the second controller into Fred's hand. "I'll teach you how to play." He'd bought all this stuff back in New York, but back then he was alone with no one to game with, so he'd only played once after getting the console. Before this, playing on such an old-school machine took him back to his past life as a kid, messing around on a little tyrant learning console with his cousins. Gotta say, Fred had real gaming talent. Kyle just showed him the basics, and soon the two were blasting through Contra like pros, even on a decent difficulty. After beating Contra, they dove into clearing Super Mario and other games. Then there were the two arcade cabinets on the other side of the room. One loaded with the fighting game Street Fighter, the other with the world's first driving sim, Motorcycle Rider. They were having a blast. Time slipped away unnoticed. After 2 hours of gaming, Kyle was starting to get bored. These were 80s and 90s products. After all, they didn't have the replay value of later games like Gimme Love 5. Fred, though, was hooked. Kyle set down his controller and tilted his head at Fred. "Wanna see my secret stash? There's something even better than games." Fred's eyes lit up. Seeing Fred turn into a full-blown gaming addict in just 2 hours, Kyle genuinely worried the guy might fry his brain. He wondered if Hogwarts had a Professor Yang. Addiction like this had no cure here. His worries were totally unnecessary, though. Electronics didn't work at Hogwarts. The magnetic field wizards gave off. Basically, a force field from leaking magic interfered with electronics and made them fail. A single wizard might not affect them, but in a place like Hogwarts packed with wizards, electronics were doomed. As for why the pocket dimension was unaffected, maybe it was just too deep underground. The three stepped out of the room again. Fred slapped George awake from his deep coma, induced by the slumbering ale he'd chugged. George rose in a daze, trailing behind the pair, his brain clearly still rebooting. Kyle led them down a corridor. After passing through a door at the far end, they emerged into a vast space, 300 meters long, 100 meters wide. Massive pillars held up the ceiling, keeping it from caving in. To their left, a stretch of open ground featured a row of targets, lined up from distant to near. On the right wall, an entire surface was plastered with an assortment of Muggle contraptions. George and Fred had no clue what they were for, but Kyle knew them inside out. These were gifts from the ever-hospitable American mob, back when he was the Dark Knight in New York. Kyle plucked 2 M16s from the wall. "Got these in the States, straight from Texas. And no, Texas isn't just about corn tortillas." George and Fred stared blankly, his humor sailing right over their heads. Whatever, explaining jokes to these two was like playing piano for a cow. He pried open a wooden crate stacked against the wall, revealing neat rows of gleaming, brassy bullets. After loading the magazines to the brim, Kyle snapped one into place with a satisfying clack and flicked off the safety. "I call this one Destroyer of Heavens," he said, hefting one rifle. "And this one's Annihilator of Earth. Together, they live up to the name." With that, he gripped both guns, one in each hand, and unleashed a storm on a humanoid target 10 meters ahead. The long barrels spat tongues of flame. Deafening cracks echoed as the target disintegrated into confetti before his eyes. Don't ask why he picked the 10-meter mark. "Classified." The twins' expressions flipped from deadpan to ravenous in an instant. "Never point the muzzle at anyone," Kyle warned, handing each a rifle. They nodded like bobbleheads on a dashboard. After witnessing the target's gruesome fate, they knew, get hit by this, and you wouldn't need Madame Pomfrey in the hospital wing. Straight to the slab, the whole Weasley clan wailing. Then the entire village of Ottery sent Catchpole tucking into a funeral feast. After correcting their stances and drilling the importance of a firm grip, Kyle still wasn't convinced. So he switched their M16s from burst to single shot. Next came the symphony. In the fragrance of ripening rice, a harvest year, gunfire blooming across the range. "George, this thing's way handier than a wand." Fred's shoulders throbbed from recoil, but his grin never faltered. George twisted around, beaming, "Tell me about it." But when he turned, he spotted Kyle cradling a Barrett M82A1 sniper rifle, 4.5 feet of matte black menace. Muzzle brake, bipod scope, fully kitted. Suddenly, the twins' iron-sighted, bare-bones M16s felt like toys. George and Fred stared at Kyle's sniper with puppy-dog eyes, silently pleading, Kyle, let us try that one. Kyle didn't bat an eye at their longing. Joke's on them. This gun cost him blood, sweat, and well, not tears, but definitely a mountain of cash earned with his own two hardworking hands. He'd sunk a fortune through shady channels to snag one from a dealer, fresh off limited military rollout. No way he was lending it out willy-nilly. 10 minutes later, George hovered at Fred's side, practically vibrating. "Fred, my turn, you've burned through 2 magazines." Under relentless nagging, Fred peeled his face from the 10x scope with utmost reluctance and yielded the firing line. While the twins lost themselves in ballistic bliss, Kyle lounged on the floor, flipping through a slim notebook. The sporadic cracks didn't faze him one bit. This notebook was the twins' bribe for a shot at the Barrett. It detailed the disillusionment charm. The charm camouflaged its target, blending person or object with the surroundings, like a chameleon shifting color and texture to match the backdrop. Kyle was hooked. Master this and sneaking around for unsavory pursuits, like peeping into the girl's bath, would be a breeze. Spit no. For research on Hogwarts after dark. Spit definitely not. Nighttime castle prowls would be a cakewalk with this spell. He skimmed the notes, then tucked it away. He hadn't even nailed basic charms yet. A high-level spell the twins, over a year into Hogwarts, still fumbled. No chance he'd crack it anytime soon. "Hey, you two," Kyle called, glancing at the wall clock. "Past 10 already. Time to pack it in." The twins checked the time and set down their rifles with heavy hearts. As they exited the range, Fred sighed. Dad would lose his mind in here. "Wait," Kyle stopped them, rummaging through a bookshelf in the living room. Moments later, he pressed 2 or 3 military magazines on tanks into their hands. Tank schematics inside. Might help your dad when he starts enchanting one. Kyle rubbed his hands, giddy. Could Mr. Weasley turn a tank into a Star Destroyer? If so, magical fighters, magical battleships, even a magical aircraft carrier. Picture it, a colossal flying carrier, dozens of ferocious dragons perched on deck, expanded hangars housing scores of enchanted fighters and bombers. Magic would supercharge range, firepower, agility, speed. One ship could topple a nation. The thought alone sent thrills down his spine. That night Kyle sank into soft sheets, mind racing. Too much had happened in a single day. Dumbledore found him, revealed he was a wizard. He thought he was the world's only metahuman. Nope, thousands like him existed. He just hadn't met any. Wizards stayed hidden. But hey, if he could cross worlds into Harry Potter's, what wasn't possible? He rolled over and drifted into deep sleep.